It is a tense moment on a fault line that has shaped global diplomacy for decades. An apparent opening for peace has surfaced between Washington and Tehran, a compact, narrowly sketched proposal that officials say could bring an end to a war that has disrupted shipping, rattled markets, and pushed the region toward a wider confrontation. At the same time, the rhetoric from the United States president has grown sharper, leaving the world watching to see whether diplomacy will prevail or whether escalation will return in force. The president posted that if Iran accepts the latest U.S. offer, the war will end and both sides' blockade of the Strait of Hormuz will be lifted. He followed that with a stark warning that has drawn international attention. If they don't agree, the bombing starts, and it will be, sadly, at a much higher level and intensity than it was before. Those words, brief and direct, sit at the center of the moment, both as an inducement and as a threat. They are designed to concentrate pressure on Tehran, make the choice painfully simple, and signal to domestic audiences that the administration intends to use force if necessary. Tehran's response so far has been measured. Iran's foreign ministry said the U.S. proposal is under review and that it will send a response to mediators in Pakistan. Officials did not commit to any timetable. That calculated pause, neither an immediate acceptance nor a flat rejection, keeps multiple options open for Iran: deeper bargaining, public posturing, or a quiet acceptance if the terms meet its core demands. For now, mediators in Islamabad are the conduit. Diplomats are working behind closed doors while public postures remain deliberately protective of leverage. What is on the table is a single-page proposal reportedly containing 14 points. According to officials involved in the discussions, the package covers two highly sensitive domains: freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz and limits on Iran's nuke Lear program. On navigation, the proposal would aim to reopen the strait to merchant vessels, a body of water through which a significant share of global oil shipments pass and which has become a symbol of the immediate strategic stakes. On nuclear matters, the wording is said to seek a return to conditions that existed before the latest escalation, with repeated insistence from U.S. officials that Iran must not be allowed to develop a nuclear weapon. Taken together, these elements form a compact bargain: security and sanctions relief in exchange for verifiable constraints on nuclear activity and an end to attacks or interdictions in the region. For negotiators, the appeal of a brief point-by-point text is clear. It lowers the bar to agreement, creates fewer traps for interpretation, and allows leaders to claim a finished deal without getting bogged down for months in the technicalities that typically accompany comprehensive accords. But the politics surrounding such a compact are complicated on multiple fronts. In Washington, pressure is rising on the president to produce a diplomatic victory. A deal that ends active hostilities would allow the administration to present a concrete outcome and to blunt domestic criticism over the costs and direction of the conflict. Officials also face a calendar pressure, a planned trip by the president to meet with China's leader next week. Several analysts warn that if a resolution with Iran is not secured before that high-profile meeting, Beijing could obtain leverage in parallel negotiations, a complication both diplomatic and strategic, and any unsolved crisis in the Persian Gulf could overshadow talks on trade, technology, and global security. Beijing is not a passive bystander. The Iranian foreign minister is reported to be in China ahead of the president's trip, an indication that Tehran is consulting with major powers as it considers the U.S. proposal. China, which maintains economic ties with Iran and strategic relations across the region, will be watching closely. Any shift in the balance of advantage could reshape its calculations in dealings with Washington. That geopolitical crosscurrent helps explain the heightened urgency in Washington and the careful, deliberate tone coming out of Tehran. Inside the American policy apparatus, messaging has been uneven. At a briefing, the Secretary of State tried to explain the wider strategy and contend with a basic question posed by journalists. Why should the American public care about events in the Strait of Hormuz? The administration has sometimes downplayed the immediate impact on U.S. daily life while emphasizing consequences for other countries and for global energy markets. Yet the dynamic on Capitol Hill and in public opinion is clear. Extended hostilities with heavy costs and casualties will be a liability for political leaders. That reality intensifies the incentive to reach a visible, creditable resolution soon. The United States had briefly launched an escort operation for merchant vessels in the Strait, dubbed Operation Freedom, to deter attacks and assure safe passage. That operation lasted only days before the administration announced its suspension. The decision was described in different ways in public remarks. Some officials framed it as a tactical recalibration, others as a cost-saving step amid a complex and expensive effort to secure shipping lanes. Critics of the move called it a climb down and questioned the coherence of policy when high-level statements and military actions appeared to be at odds. The administration, meanwhile, framed the suspension as compatible with its broader diplomatic push, a narrative that will be tested by what happens next. Complicating the diplomatic landscape are reports that damage to U.S. military facilities during the recent surge in attacks may be greater than initially disclosed by military officials. If the scope of strikes against American assets proves more extensive, political calculus at home could shift dramatically. Leaders who have already been pressed to show decisive action will face renewed scrutiny over whether the response was proportional and effective and whether more force is necessary to deter future attacks. The sequence of events now likely rests on several hinge points. First, Tehran must signal whether it will accept the one-page proposal, seek amendments, or walk away. Its decision to consult mediators in Pakistan and to confer with partners like China suggests it is treating the offer seriously, but Iran also has reasons to extract additional assurances on sanctions relief, on timing, and on how verifiable any nuclear limits would be. Second, Washington must determine how to translate the text into verification mechanisms that both satisfy U.S. domestic audiences, can be accepted by Tehran. That tradecraft, inspections, timelines, sequencing of concessions, and enforcement measures will be the invisible scaffolding that T decides whether a short paper can support a durable peace. Third-party actors will influence the outcome. Regional powers, global traders, and allied navies all have stakes in the outcome. If the strait is reopened quickly and reliably, insurance costs fall, shipping routes normalize, and markets soothe. If the standoff continues, a cascading risk of miscalculation increases. An intercepted ship, a misfired missile, or a tactical engagement at sea could trigger a sharp military escalation that neither side wants, but that could spiral nonetheless. Public opinion matters as much as technical clauses. Inside the United States, the appetite for a prolonged overseas conflict is limited. Voters may be inclined to favor a negotiated outcome if it is presented as strong, verifiable, and as protecting U.S. and allied interests. Equally, if the public perceives a deal as weak or rushed, political backlash could make any agreement difficult to sustain. Leaders in Tehran face their own dom este calculus, a settlement that loosens economic pressure while safeguarding core national interests could be politically useful. A settlement perceived as capitulation could be politically costly. There are several basic scenarios to consider. In the most optimistic, Iran accepts the 14-point text, or negotiators bridge a small gap quickly. The strait is reopened under agreed procedures. Nuclear constraints are verified, and both sides claim a fragile but meaningful victory. Diplomacy would then move to the hard work of implementation, inspections, phased sanctions relief, and mechanisms to address future violations while regional actors adjust to a reduced tempo of crisis. The second, less hopeful scenario sees protracted bargaining and incremental steps. Tehran might accept some elements and stall on others, seeking guarantees and sequencing that bolster its negotiations. negotiating position. Washington might reciprocate with limited easing in exchange for incremental verification. In that as the conflict could move from kinetic confrontation to a tense, protracted diplomatic negotiation with regular flare-ups, but without an immediate large-scale offensive. A third scenario is the one the president alluded to with his stark warning: rejection of the offer by Tehran, followed by an intensification of military action. If they don't agree, the bombing starts, he wrote, and the force implied in his statement would represent a dramatic escalation with region-wide consequences. That course carries profound risks: civilian casualties, disruption of energy supplies, and the potential for a wider war involving regional proxies and allied forces. Military planners and diplomats alike understand that a return to heavy bombing would not be a short, clean operation. It would invite retaliation, testing, and a costly cycle of action and response. Whatever path unfolds, the role of intermediaries like Pakistan and the presence of influential actors like China create spaces for diplomacy. Mediators can lower the temperature by offering face-saving clauses, sequencing arrangements, and technical frameworks that make acceptance politically palatable. They can also be conduits for back-channel assurances and verification steps that avoid public grandstanding. For the moment, Islamabad fills that role, an indication that some in the region prefer negotiation to confrontation. There are practical questions to which negotiators must quickly find answers. How will freedom of navigation be guaranteed? Will there be multinational escorts, or will regional navies assume responsibility? What verification regime will be put in place for nuclear activity, and who will conduct inspections? How will sanctions be lifted, and on what schedule? Will there be a mechanism for dispute resolution to prevent a single incident from unraveling the entire accord? The answers will determine whether a short diplomatic paper can be translated into sustainable peace. The international now community is watching how leaders frame victory and defeat. In Washington, officials will likely seek to present any successful agreement as proof of diplomatic resolve and strategic clarity, a way to show that pressure produced a result. In Tehran, leaders will look for language that preserves national dignity, outlines clear benefits, and creates a path back to normal economic relations. The third parties, the overarching goal is stability, predictable shipping lanes, secure energy markets, and a reduced risk of sudden military escalation. There are moral and human considerations beneath the geopolitics. Lives have been disrupted, families displaced, and communities scarred by the fog of war. Restoring peaceful access to shipping lanes is not simply an economic measure in many ports and towns along the Gulf. It means jobs, livelihoods, and the return of a degree of normalcy. Any agreement that ends active hostilities would allow humanitarian and reconstruction efforts to begin on a firmer footing. Finally, the moment demands sober leadership. Diplomatic openings can close as quickly as they appear. A short paper with 14 points can become the starting point for a lasting settlement, or it can be a pretext for more fighting. The next actions matter, whether Tehran replies with a constructive answer, whether Washington translates public threats into credible follow-through while preserving space for negotiation, and whether mediators can turn a fragile consensus into binding commitments. The coming days are decisive. Both sides face a choice: to convert a brief diplomatic aperture into a durable ceasefire and an orderly de-escalation, or to allow rhetoric and miscalculation to return the region to a more dangerous chapter. As diplomats confer in closed rooms and leaders posture in public, ordinary people around the Gulf and beyond watch, hoping that the Strait will become a